The year was 1305. The streets of London buzzed with noise, vendors shouting, carts rattling, horses clopping on stone roads. But on one warm August morning, the usual rhythm of the city was broken by something far darker. A crowd was forming. A crowd, ready to cheer, to jeer, and to watch a man die. That man was William Wallace, a name that would echo through centuries. To the English, he was a traitor. To the Scots, he was a hero. And to King Edward I of England, he was a dangerous symbol that had to be destroyed in the most brutal way possible. Wallace wasn't just any rebel. He had led a resistance that had humiliated the English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. He had shouted for freedom when others had bowed their heads. He had become the living image of a Scotland that refused to be ruled. But on this day, none of that mattered. The English crown had finally captured him. And they weren't going to simply hang him. No, this execution was to be a message, not just to Scotland, but to the entire world. Back then, executions were not private. They were public shows meant to entertain, warn, and control. But even in that violent time, what the English planned for Wallace stood out. They chose the most cruel method in their arsenal: hanging, drawing, and quartering a punishment meant not just to kill, but to humiliate and destroy. This wasn't just the end of Wallace's life. It was an attempt to erase everything he stood for. To understand why they went to such extremes, we must look at the political fire burning at the time. Scotland was fighting to stay independent. England wanted to crush the dream. Edward I, known as Longshanks for his towering height and towering cruelty, saw rebellion not as a challenge, but as a disease to be wiped out completely. Wallace had become more than a man. He was a flame in the darkness for many Scots, and Edward wanted that flame snuffed out in the ugliest way possible. Wallace had spent years evading capture. He had hidden in forests, escaped battles, and even survived betrayals. But the net was closing in. By 1305, most Scottish nobles had surrendered or made peace with the English crown. Wallace stood almost alone, still fighting, still refusing to kneel, and that made him dangerous. Not because he still had an army, but because he still had belief. So Edward did what kings do best. He ordered the machinery of fear to crush him. Spies were sent, rewards were promised, allies were turned, and in August 1305, Wallace was finally captured near Glasgow, reportedly betrayed by a fellow Scotsman who had sworn loyalty to England. The betrayal was the first nail in his coffin. What followed was worse. The English dragged Wallace from Scotland to London in chains. He wasn't given a quiet cell or even a quick sentence. Instead, he was paraded through towns like a trophy. People threw things at him. They mocked him. Some were curious, others were hateful, but all were being shown what happened to those who defied English rule. By the time Wallace arrived in London, his body was broken, but not his will. He had lost weight. He had been kept in terrible conditions, but he still held his head high. On August 23, 1305, Wallace stood before an English court. They didn't give him a real trial. They didn't allow him to speak freely. The judges spoke Latin. Wallace likely didn't even understand everything said. But when asked if he had committed treason, Wallace answered clearly, "I was never Edward's subject." That answer sealed his fate. He was declared guilty. The sentence, dragged through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled, beheaded, and cut into 4 parts. And that's just the beginning of the horror. To know what happened next, and why it still haunts Scottish memory today, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you don't miss what comes next. William Wallace's punishment wasn't just about death. It was a carefully planned show of terror. King Edward didn't want to silence a man. He wanted to erase a symbol. The morning of Wallace's execution was not quiet. Thousands of people gathered in London. From the Tower, where Wallace had been kept prisoner, the streets stretched ahead, packed with onlookers. Vendors sold food. Children sat on their parents' shoulders. Men placed bets on how long he would survive the torture. This wasn't justice. It was theater. Wallace was brought out, chained and stripped. But before he even reached the execution ground, the suffering began. He was tied to a wooden hurdle of flat board. Then horses were hooked to it, and he was dragged through the city's filthy roads. His bare skin scraped against stone and mud. His body bounced and twisted as the crowd jeered. Sharp rocks tore his back. Garbage and waste clung to his wounds. Every second of pain was public, and the route was long, intentionally long, planned to pass through London's busiest places. Every corner, every market square, every church. The goal was to let as many eyes as possible see the humiliation of the man who once led Scotland. As fight. By the time Wallace reached Smithfield, London's execution ground, his body was already bleeding and bruised. But the horror was only beginning. A high wooden platform had been built for the event, not to show respect but to give the crowd a better view. At the center of the platform stood the executioner. He wasn't just a butcher with a blade. He was an expert in pain. His job wasn't to kill Wallace quickly. His job was to keep him alive as long as possible while tearing him apart. Wallace was first hanged. A rope was tied around his neck, and he was hoisted into the air. But the noose wasn't tight enough to snap his neck. That would have been too merciful. Instead, he slowly choked, his body jerking, his face turning dark purple, his tongue pushing out from his mouth. The crowd roared. Some screamed insults. Others laughed. A few stood silent, unable to look away. Just as his body began to fall limp, the rope was cut. Wallace fell to the ground, still alive. What came next was worse. He was strapped down, arms and legs spread. Then the executioner took a sharp knife and cut Wallace's belly open. No drugs, no mercy, no pause. He sliced deep into Wallace's body. Then, organ by organ, the executioner began pulling them out. The stomach, the intestines, the liver, the heart, all while Wallace was still breathing. Some say Wallace screamed. Others say he stayed silent, biting his own tongue in pain. But all accounts agree he didn't beg for his life. Each organ was shown to the crowd, held up like a prize. Then it was thrown into a fire burning. Beside the scaffold, the smoke of burning flesh filled the air. In medieval belief, the bowels were tied to the soul. Burning them meant burning a man's spirit. It wasn't enough to destroy his body. His humanity had to be wiped away too. But Wallace still lived. Somehow, he clung to life. The final step was the end of all suffering. The executioner took an axe and brought it down hard on Wallace's neck. His head rolled to the ground, blood pouring from the stump. But even in death, the humiliation continued. His head was placed on a spike, dipped in tar so it would not rot quickly, and carried away for display. It was later mounted on London Bridge for everyone to see, a daily warning to all who passed. As for the rest of him, his body was not buried. It was cut into 4 pieces. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, one to Berwick, another to Stirling, and the last to Perth. Each part nailed up in public squares. This was not about disposing of a corpse. It was a message in flesh, a message that said, this is what happens when you fight the English crown. But something strange happened. Instead of fear, many Scots felt fury. Instead of silence, whispers of resistance began again. The plan to crush the Scottish spirit had backfired. Wallace's horrifying end had turned him into something larger than life. Not just a warrior, not just a rebel, but a martyr. To uncover how his death sparked something the English never expected. Stay with us. But first, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell, so you never miss the rest of this untold history. The story of Wallace's execution did not end with his death. In fact, for many Scots, the day marked the beginning of something deeper, something emotional, something unforgettable. When news of his brutal execution reached Scotland, it spread like wildfire. People whispered about the pain he had suffered. Some wept, others clenched their fists. His enemies had meant to destroy him, but what they created was a legend. Wallace's body may have been torn apart, but his memory came together in the hearts of the people. The sight of his limbs hanging in public squares shocked even those who had once doubted him. Mothers told their children his story. Farmers spoke of him at night. Even nobles who had once surrendered to the English began to feel shame. But the emotional impact went far beyond grief. It planted seeds of anger, and that anger would not die. At the time of Wallace's execution, Scotland was at its weakest. Many of its nobles had already bent the knee to King Edward. They thought peace would be better than war. But Wallace's death showed them what English peace really looked like: chains, torture, and humiliation. One man, in particular, was deeply moved. His name was Robert the Bruce. Bruce had been torn between loyalty to his own ambition and the struggle for Scottish freedom. He had once even fought on the English side, but after Wallace's death, something shifted inside him. Historians believe that Bruce saw Wallace's execution as a turning point, a line that could not be crossed twice. The English had shown that mercy would never be given. They had shown what fate awaited anyone who dared to stand tall. From this horror, Bruce found purpose. Meanwhile, the ordinary people of Scotland, farmers, blacksmiths, fishermen, began to talk in secret. They remembered how Wallace had won the Battle of Stirling Bridge, not with numbers, but with courage and clever thinking. They remembered how he fought for them, not for land or gold, but for freedom. Wallace's death did something no battle could do. It unified the hearts of a broken nation. Even those who were afraid began to feel something new. Not just sadness, but pride. Not just pain, but defiance. Scotland's future was still uncertain, but one thing had changed forever. The English had killed the man, but they had created a symbol that swords couldn't destroy. As months passed, small groups of rebels began to rise again. They attacked English outposts, ambushed soldiers, and spread the memory of Wallace like wildfire. They shouted his name in battle. They carried his courage in their hearts. Wallace was no longer leading the fight, but his spirit was. The English didn't realize what they had done. They thought they had shown power, but they had shown fear. Their need to destroy Wallace so completely revealed how much they had feared his influence. And fear, once exposed, is like a crack in a wall. It spreads. The brutality of Wallace's execution gave Scotland something it didn't have before: a martyr. Someone whose story could not be controlled by kings or courts. And as more people remembered what he stood for, one question began to rise in every village, in every town. If Wallace could face the pain and never beg, then what are we afraid of? This simple thought began to change everything. The English crown had believed that fear would keep Scotland silent. They were wrong. After Wallace's execution, Edward I focused on strengthening his grip. He tightened his control over Scottish cities and sent more troops to the north. Castles were fortified. Local leaders were pressured to stay loyal. But something invisible had begun to grow in Scotland: an idea. The idea of freedom. Edward could crush rebels. He could burn villages. But he couldn't erase the memory of what Wallace stood for. Across the land, his name became a quiet rebellion. People carved it into trees. Children played games pretending to be him. Priests whispered his courage in church halls. Wallace had failed to win independence in life, but in death, he had become something far more dangerous, an unkillable story. And then came Robert the Bruce. Bruce was a man of noble birth, a politician by nature. He had once made deals with both the English and the Scots. But after Wallace's death, Bruce made a choice that changed the course of history. In 1306, less than a year after Wallace's execution, Bruce declared himself King of Scots. It was a bold, risky move. Many still doubted him. But Bruce had seen what Wallace's defiance had meant to the people. He knew that Scotland needed more than strategy. It needed a reason to believe. Bruce would now lead a fight that was not only military, but emotional. And the English response was immediate. Edward I, furious at Bruce's claim to the throne, unleashed a brutal campaign across Scotland. He ordered executions of Bruce's allies, including several members of his family. Bruce's brothers were captured and hanged. His sister and daughter were imprisoned in cages, exposed to the public like animals. It was cruelty with a purpose to break Bruce like they had tried to break Wallace. But Bruce didn't stop. He changed his tactics. Instead of large battles, he used smaller, faster raids. He struck and vanished, his forces hid in forests and mountains, moving like shadows. Wallace had shown that cleverness could beat strength, and Bruce followed that lesson well. Over the years, he won back ground, village by village, hill by hill, castle by castle. The English were caught in a game they didn't understand. They were used to open war, grand armies, and quick victories. But this new war was slow, patient, and deeply personal. The Scots were no longer just fighting for land. They were fighting for Wallace, for the pain he endured, for the screams the crowd had heard at Smithfield, for the blood-soaked path his body had taken through London. Every English soldier who fell was not just a military loss. It was justice for Wallace. And it wasn't just Scots who saw this. News of Wallace's execution had spread across Europe. Other kingdoms watched with shock at the brutal display. Diplomats whispered about the English king's cruelty. Some admired Edward's power, but others questioned how far a king could go to keep control. The image of Wallace, tied and torn, had crossed borders. His suffering became a lesson not only for Scots, but for anyone who dared to speak of freedom. Edward I had hoped to scare the world. Instead, he had shamed it. By 1307, the English king lay dying, old, tired, and filled with rage. He gave one final order, that his bones be carried into Scotland in battle, so even in death, he could still fight his enemies. But that wish was never fulfilled. Edward died, and with him ended the darkest chapter of English domination. His son, Edward II, lacked his father's will, and Scotland, inspired by Wallace's courage and Bruce's leadership, began to rise. The tide was turning. The years after Wallace's death were filled with blood, betrayal, and battles. But slowly, the winds began to shift. Robert the Bruce, now crowned King of Scots, was no longer hiding. He was fighting in the open and winning. His army was small, but their belief was fierce. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were fighting with Wallace's ghost behind them, and the memory of his torture pushed them forward. Bruce's forces retook towns that had flown English flags for years. English governors were forced to flee. Garrison after garrison fell. Scotland was waking up. And then, in 1314, 9 years after Wallace had been executed, came the battle that changed everything. The Battle of Bannockburn. It was the moment that Scotland roared. The English army, massive and confident, marched north to crush Bruce once and for all. Thousands of trained knights, heavy horses, and foot soldiers all ready to finish what Edward I had started. But Bruce wasn't afraid. He chose his battlefield carefully, a marshy area near Stirling, where the English cavalry would struggle, and when the fight came, Bruce's army held firm, spears clashed, horses fell, knights drowned in mud. The mighty English forces broke apart under pressure, and when the dust cleared, it was Scotland that stood tall. The news of the Scottish victory spread across Europe like thunder. Bannockburn wasn't just a military win, it was a spiritual one. It proved that a smaller, poorer nation could defeat a powerful empire when its heart was strong enough. And behind that heart was Wallace. People remembered how he had once stood in defiance, how he had refused to kneel, how he had screamed without fear as his body was ripped open. They remembered his fire, and now they saw his dream being born on the battlefield. Bannockburn was his revenge delivered by Bruce. But born from Wallace's sacrifice, after the battle, Scotland entered a new phase. It wasn't yet fully free, but it was no longer fully controlled either. The English began to lose interest. Their own civil wars and royal problems distracted them, and Scotland, while still wounded, began to breathe again. But the memory of Wallace remained sharp. He had no grave, no tomb, no monument at the time. His body had been scattered across the land like ashes thrown to the wind. But in people's minds, he was everywhere. In the hills, in the woods, in the old battlefields, in the fires of rebellion. And over time, his story grew. Writers and poets began to speak of him. Songs were sung in his name. Children were named after him. And though some parts of the tale became legend, the core of the story remained true. He had died for his country, and he had never once begged for mercy. For centuries, Scotland held onto that image. The man chained, bleeding, but proud. The man who was offered nothing but pain, and who gave back only silence. That silence became louder than any sword. Even in English memory, Wallace couldn't be erased. Historians wrote about his trial, his torture, his execution. Some called him a traitor, but many could not hide their awe at his courage. And as the generations passed, something strange happened. The horror of his death became part of his power. People stopped talking only about the pain. They started talking about the strength it took to face the pain without breaking. About how one man, alone, changed the course of a nation, not with gold, not with armies, but with belief. The English had hoped to destroy him by tearing him apart. Instead, they made him unforgettable. Years passed, then decades, but the name William Wallace refused to disappear. In a world where kings ruled by force, Wallace's story became something rare, a story of a common man who stood against a crown, alone, and never bent. Even though Scotland eventually won moments of peace and even independence, the memory of Wallace always stood apart. He had no royal blood, no palace, no crown, and yet his voice had shaken a kingdom. It wasn't until much later that people began to understand just how deep the scars of his death had gone. In villages across Scotland, the older generation would sit by fires and speak of Wallace's execution not as history, but as witness. They told of how his flesh was burned, how his body was torn, and how not once did he ask for mercy. To them, he wasn't just a rebel. He was proof that dignity could survive even in the most monstrous cruelty. This memory passed from voice to voice, from poems to pages, and slowly, Wallace became more than real. He became a legend, a living myth, not because he fought battles, but because of how he died. The more cruel the story, the more powerful his image became. Wallace didn't just fight for Scotland, he became Scotland. By the 15th and 16th centuries, as Scotland faced new threats and new rulers, Wallace was still being invoked. His story was used to inspire soldiers, to encourage leaders, to remind the people what courage looked like when everything else had been stripped away. And his method of death, so carefully designed to erase him, became a sacred scar. In churches and secret gatherings, people prayed not for Wallace's soul, but for his strength. His pain was remembered like a sacrifice. His screams, burned into memory, became part of the country's conscience. And though no one could undo what had been done to him, they could ensure he would never be forgotten. But Wallace's impact didn't stop at Scotland's borders. As ideas of freedom began to rise across Europe against tyrants, against empires, Wallace's name appeared again and again. In France, in Ireland, even in the early colonies of America, he was mentioned in pamphlets, in speeches, in protests, to people fighting for their own liberty. Wallace wasn't just a man from the past. He was a god. In later centuries, as human rights movements began to grow, scholars looked back at Wallace's execution with horror, not just because of its violence, but because it showed how power could twist justice into a weapon. His trial was a lie. His punishment was torture masked as law. And yet, Wallace had stood through it all, not with magic, not with armies, but with the quiet power of refusal. He had refused to kneel. He had refused to break. He had refused to die the way they wanted him to. And that refusal became one of the most powerful acts of resistance ever recorded. His story began as one man picking up a sword in the hills of Scotland. It ended with his name, carried by generations who never saw his face, but carried his fire. In the centuries that followed, many heroes came and went, but William Wallace stayed. Not in castles or scrolls, but in the blood and bones of Scottish identity. He became a silent force. Behind every protest, every uprising, every demand for respect, and yet there was no grave for people to visit, no statue for them to lay flowers. His body had been scattered by design, burned, buried, displayed, and forgotten by those who killed him. but they failed. Instead of one grave, Wallace had thousands. He lived in every town where his name was whispered, in every child who heard about the man who didn't scream. When Scotland lost battles, they remembered Wallace. When Scotland won victories, they thanked him. In the 1700s and 1800s, as nations across the world started asking what it meant to be free, Wallace's image returned again. Writers and thinkers found in him the perfect symbol, a man without riches, without title, without army, yet so dangerous to tyranny that a king tore him apart in public. That was no ordinary man. That was power. Scottish poets wrote of him as a soul that walked the highlands. Artists painted him standing tall even when surrounded. Songs describe his voice echoing across the lochs. He was more than history now. And with every new wave of oppression, whether political, cultural, or economic, Scots remember the lesson of Wallace's death. Even if your body is broken, your will doesn't have to be. By the late 19th century, as nationalism grew across Europe, Wallace became a rallying point again. His story was taught in schools, his legacy debated in Parliament, and finally, after centuries of silence, the world began to speak his name with reverence instead of fear. A towering monument was built in Stirling, the place where he had once won a great victory. It stood not just as a tribute, but as an apology, a long overdue recognition that Scotland had not forgotten her bravest son. Visitors came from all over the world to see the stone tower. They climbed its steps, read its plaques, and stared out at the land Wallace once defended. Some came with pride, some with sorrow. All left changed. Even Hollywood, centuries later, would find Wallace's story too powerful to ignore. Films brought his life to millions. Some scenes were true, others exaggerated. But one thing could not be denied: the world wanted to hear his name, not for entertainment, but because the pain he endured still struck a nerve, because oppression still exists, because courage is still rare, and because what Wallace stood for, freedom, dignity, and refusal to kneel, is something every soul understands, no matter the country, no matter the time. People who watched those films didn't just cheer at battle scenes, they cried at his final moments, not because it was dramatic, but because it felt real. Deep down, we all fear being broken. But Wallace showed the world that you can still win, even as you're being destroyed. That truth is more powerful than any sword. Wallace's life is not just history, it is a question, a mirror. What do you stand for? What will you endure? And when the moment comes, will you stay silent, or will you, like him, face the fire and never look away? To truly understand what made Wallace different, you have to go back to the moment of his death, not just the pain, but the silence. Most people, when faced with certain death, scream, they beg, they cry for their mothers, they pray for mercy. But Wallace didn't. Eyewitnesses wrote that even while his body was being torn apart, he refused to cry out. His face twisted in agony, but he stayed awake. He stared ahead. He did not speak the words his killers wanted to hear. He could have begged for a quick death. He could have asked forgiveness from the king. He could have traded his pain for peace. But he didn't. That silence was louder than any speech. It shook the hearts of those watching. Even some English in the crowd, who had come to laugh or jeer, felt something shift. They saw not a traitor but a man who believed so deeply in his cause that even the worst pain couldn't break him. That moment became legend, not just in Scotland, but in every corner of the world where people face injustice. Because Wallace's silence was not weakness, it was control. His enemies had taken everything: his freedom, his dignity, even his body. But they couldn't take his soul, and in the end, that's what made him powerful. It's why tyrants fear men like Wallace. Not because they lead armies, but because they lead hearts. Because they remind others that you don't need to wear a crown to be a king. You don't need to hold a sword to be dangerous. All you need is the courage to stand your ground, even when standing means falling. Generations of Scots grew up with his story not as bedtime tales, but as a code to live by. They learned that freedom isn't free. It comes with blood, with betrayal, with loss. but also with something stronger: hope. Hope that your pain will mean something, that your death won't be forgotten, that your name will carry on. And Wallace's name did more than carry. It roared. His execution was meant to be the end. Instead, it became the beginning of something much bigger. Even today, in modern Scotland, his spirit is everywhere. In marches, in memorials, in classrooms, where children still draw his face. In songs, where his name is sung as if he's still watching from the Highlands. And not just in Scotland, around the world, where people rise up against dictators, where voices are silenced and rights are stolen, there, too, Wallace's story appears. Because he is the perfect example of what happens when one man chooses death with dignity over life in chains. The tools they used to kill him, ropes, knives, axes, could only hurt his body. They never reached what mattered most. That is why Wallace matters. That is why, over 700 years later, we still remember a man who died screaming inside, but never once screamed out loud. Wallace's execution wasn't just the death of a man, it was the display of an empire's fear. When a king needs to cut someone into pieces and show those pieces across for cities, it means the person wasn't just dangerous with a sword, he was dangerous with an idea. Wallace's idea was simple, that no king, no army, no foreign crown has the right to own your soul. And that terrified Edward I more than anything else. He ruled with laws and armies, but Wallace ruled with conviction. Edward used fire and steel. Wallace used belief. So the English crown didn't just try to kill Wallace. They tried to erase him. That's why there was no burial. That's why they scattered his limbs. That's why they burned his organs. They were trying to destroy his very existence. But they failed in the one place it mattered most: in memory. The English government of the time recorded his trial in careful detail. Every word, every punishment, every step. They wanted history to remember the punishment, but history remembered the man generations later. Scholars studied those documents. They didn't find a criminal. They found a warning about what happens when fear becomes policy. When justice becomes revenge. The way Wallace was treated helped shape future debates about law, about dignity, about human rights. Centuries later, as people begin writing the first international laws about fair trials and humane treatment, Wallace's story was brought up not as a model, but as a reminder of what must never be repeated. He had been dragged, tortured, and mutilated, all in the name of justice. But the world began to see through that word. They saw Wallace not as a traitor, but as a man who had been punished for refusing to kneel. That shift in how people viewed his death changed everything. In time, monuments were raised, books were written. His image, once spat on in the streets of London, was now placed on coins, statues, and school walls. And in all of this, Wallace never became a perfect saint. He was still a warrior. He still took lives in battle. He was not soft or gentle, but that's what made him real. He wasn't born to be a legend. He became one by standing firm when everyone else fell. That is why his story survived longer than empires. Long after Edward I's bones turned to dust, long after the towers of kings crumbled, long after the courts that condemned him were forgotten, Wallace remained a rebel, a martyr, a mirror. Because his story forces us to ask hard questions. What do we believe in? What would we die for? And do we have the strength to stand alone in a world that often bows to power? Wallace reminds us that it is okay to stand tall even when the rope is tight around your neck. Centuries have passed since William Wallace took his final breath, but the silence he left behind still speaks. He never wrote books. He left no speech. No golden crown sat on his head. But what he gave the world was something far greater than words. He gave an example of what it means to choose pain over submission, to choose death over dishonor, to choose truth, even when the world is screaming at you to lie. In today's world, we often talk about freedom. We wear it on shirts, print it on flags, and speak of it in speeches. But Wallace lived in a time where freedom had a price, a real price. And he paid it with everything he had. When he was dragged through the streets of London, he was alone. When the executioner's knife tore into his flesh, no one stopped it. When the fire consumed his insides, there were no cries of mercy from the crowd. But still, he didn't break. And that's why his story remains, not because of the sword he carried, but because of the silence he held. Today, his name is written in stone. His statue stands tall above Stirling. School children learn about him not as a criminal, but as a national hero. Artists paint him, filmmakers recreate his battles, and poets still whisper his words. But perhaps more importantly, his spirit lives in every person who refuses to bow when they know something is wrong. Every time a voice speaks out against injustice, every time someone chooses truth over comfort, Wallace walks with them. He reminds us that courage isn't about winning, it's about standing. He reminds us that even when your body is bound, your soul can still be free. And he reminds us that history doesn't remember those who obey it, remembers those who resist. Wallace's enemies tried to silence him with fire, steel, and shame. But their greatest failure was thinking pain could kill an idea. It couldn't. His execution, meant to end a rebellion, became the birth of something far more dangerous: hope. So today, when we look back at William Wallace, we do not see a man broken by torture. We see a man who stood in front of kings and said, "You don't own me." We see the price of freedom carved into flesh. We see that even when the body dies, the cause can live forever. And we remember, freedom is never free. It is bought with blood, held with courage, and kept alive by memory. And as long as we remember Wallace, not just the myth, but the man, we remember what it truly means to live with dignity. So if this story moved you, if Wallace's sacrifice gave you chills, if his courage reminded you of what really matters in life, then please subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss the stories of those who gave everything to change the world. Because some histories are not just meant to be studied, they're meant to be felt.